Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to speak to what is truly an historic trade agreement between Canada and the European Union. I do want to begin by extending congratulations because these kinds of negotiations, free trade agreements, at the best of times are difficult. But when you have an agreement like CETA, which is the acronym that we describe this trade agreement by, when you have an agreement that complex, it is very difficult to get it to the finish line. And I did want to extend congratulations to the Prime Minister and also to his International Trade Minister for doggedly pushing this file forward. It's this close to the finish line. It's not quite there yet, but it's oh so close. And then I also want to thank former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who had the foresight and courage to move ahead with negotiations at a time when many naysayers said this couldn't be done. In fact, I recall during these negotiations, which I led for 4.5 years, the many times when people would come up and say, you know what, there's no way you're going to be able to address that issue. There's no way you're going to be able to open up agricultural access in the European Union. And you know, each step along the way, Prime Minister Stephen Harper had our back, had the back of our team, making sure we got this done. And so our country owes Stephen Harper a tremendous debt of gratitude for his remarkable achievement. I also want to thank my former cabinet colleagues for enthusiastically supporting this agreement every single step of the way and for providing helpful advice in their areas of expertise. I especially want to congratulate and thank my colleague, the member for Battleford's Lloydsminster, who was the Minister of Agriculture as our previous Conservative government was negotiating this agreement. He worked on one of the most difficult provisions of this agreement, which is agricultural access into the European Union, also addressing some of our sensitivities on the Canadian side. And he was able to get it done in a way that our stakeholders strongly ended up supporting this agreement. And I'm pleased to see that he is now the official opposition's trade critic, holding the Liberal government's feet to the fire as they try to defend and promote Canada's trade interests around the world. I also wanted to thank Chief Negotiator Steve Verhoeven and his large team of sectoral negotiators for a job very well done. These are Canadian, Mr. Speaker, these are some of our best Canadian negotiators. They represent the very best that Canada has to offer. And their advice is not only sought by us as governments here in Canada, their advice is sought around the world because Canada is a kinder, gentler, more flexible negotiating partner, but we are firm. We have resolve when we negotiate, and the standard we've set is that we will not negotiate a trade agreement unless it's in Canada's national interest. And then I want to also thank my friend, the former Premier of Quebec, Jean Charest, for first imagining what was possible and then inspiring us to take the first step in broadening our economic partnership with the European Union. And Mr. Speaker, that is exactly what this trade agreement achieves. It represents a broadening of our economic partnership with the European Union in a way that many of us could not have imagined, say, a decade ago. So I wanted to just walk through this agreement. First of all, I want to talk about the agreement itself, the deal, then the beneficiaries of this agreement. I wanted to talk about the opportunity that this represents for Canadians, and then also the challenge or challenges that we still face in getting this agreement over the line. This agreement is the most comprehensive the world has ever seen, and I say that without reservation. It delves into areas that were never considered before as being possible within a trade agreement. This agreement has been compared to the North American Free Trade Agreement, and I would admit that NAFTA is still the definitive trade agreement between Canada and its two North American partners. And because of the scope and size of that relationship, it also dwarfs all of the other trade relationships we have around the world. But CETA is much more comprehensive. It is a complex agreement. It means that it took longer to negotiate that because of the complexities and because we needed to have this agreement to be in Canada's national interest. And I recall on a number of occasions when we as Canadian negotiators, as our Canadian team, had to leave the table and say the deal that's there is not in Canada's interest. And then a month or two later, we would go back, the other side would come back, we'd come up with new approaches to some of the obstacles that faced us, and we'd find ways through those obstacles. And this agreement is complex because of the novel and bold approaches which the two sides agreed to take. For example, negotiating expanded services access. Services like engineering and digital technology, information technology. We want to make sure Canadians have an expanded marketplace in the world to sell high-quality services into. And what we did is, for the first time ever, Canada and the EU agreed to use a negative list approach to negotiating services. What that means is, if a service is not included on the list of approved services for additional market access, or if it's not specifically excluded, any future services that might be developed in a rapidly evolving global marketplace will be captured by this agreement and will be provided full access into the EU and into Canada. So that is unique in this agreement. What else is unique is, for the first time ever, Canada had its provinces and territories at the negotiating table when it came to areas of their sole or shared jurisdiction. And what this allowed us to do was to secure outcomes that none of our trade agreements before have ever secured. That was, for example, an outcome on government procurement. When a government goes out and solicits contracts for services or for properties or for goods and services, whenever that happens, typically governments protect their home market. What we have done is expanded government procurement access for Canadian companies to start bidding on projects within the European Union, which is the world's largest service market. And so again, we were able to come up with a highly ambitious outcome on government procurement. And we know that trade, when done right, benefits all partners and has the potential to raise living standards and prosperity all around the world. And that's also, Mr. Speaker, why we took great care in negotiating outcomes in things such as goods trade, services trade, technical barriers to trade, labor mobility, on the environment, which Canadians care very much about, intellectual property, protecting our innovators, geographical indications, and as I mentioned, government procurement. For example, in the area of trade of goods, which includes things such as agricultural products, automobiles, fish and seafood. We have some of the best fish and seafood quality products in the world. When it comes to forestry products, when it comes to equipment and machinery, we have opened up the marketplace in the EU for these products. We are eliminating 98% of all tariffs that presently face Canadian exporters within the European marketplace, including the 10% tariff on Canadian cars when they're sold in that market. That's good news for our auto industry. And what we've also done, this agreement is very special because it provides Canada with a unique global market access to both the European Union and the United States, because we already have a free trade agreement, NAFTA, with the United States and Mexico. But we are the first major economy in the world to also have a free trade agreement with the European Union, which is a marketplace of over 500 million consumers. This is a huge advantage for Canada. We also negotiated services. And the question we had to ask was, where does Canada's comparative advantage lie? Where does Canada, as a highly developed, highly educated, highly innovative country, have an advantage? It's not in manually sitting on a production line putting together widgets. That is not the future for Canada. The future for Canada is in the knowledge economy. That's where our future prosperity lies. Areas such as engineering, digital animation, gaming, health services, education, cybersecurity, information technology, and so many other areas that have high-paying jobs and are the economy of the future. Let me give you an example. Engineering. Did you know that Canada is the third largest exporter of engineering services in the world? Really? Third largest. A country of small population, 35 million people, in a global marketplace of 7 billion people, up against giants like Germany and the United Kingdom and Japan, the United States. Guess what? We rank third, Mr. Speaker. And these are high-paying jobs. Canadians carving out a reputation for their innovation and their excellence and the quality of the services they provide. So this trade agreement dramatically improves our export potential for these services. Now let me talk a little bit about the beneficiaries of this agreement. Of course, there are the manufacturers, the exporters, that want to access the European marketplace, but for so many years have been unable to do so because of high tariffs and because of very high non-tariff barriers. All the rules and regulations and standards behind the borders that frustrate our exporters and provide protectionism for European companies. In large part, we are addressing those challenges, both on the tariff and non-tariff side. So it's good news for manufacturers and for exporters. It also means greater mobility for the workforce that our manufacturers have. The ability to move professionals back and forth between our two trading partners. The ability to move senior management personnel back and forth seamlessly. That's been improved in this agreement. Investors will be very happy because if, in fact, the investor-state dispute settlement measures are actually brought into force, our investors will have greater protection against discrimination and expropriation without compensation within the European Union. I've already mentioned our service providers, what a huge market they'll now have available to them. They're going to be very happy. And then there are those that sometimes slip through the crack, and those are Canada's consumers. When we remove tariff barriers on the European side, what happens? We get access to their marketplace. We're also removing tariff barriers on the Canadian side, which means Canadian consumers will have access to better quality products at better prices, improving their value proposition. This is excellent news for Canada's consumers who are trying to make the buck stretch a little longer. And that's what we're accommodating here. So, Mr. Speaker, some people have said, well, you know, there are going to be winners and losers. And certainly there are going to be a lot of winners under this agreement. Clearly, when you witness the hundreds of industry stakeholders and the thousands of companies across Canada that have voiced support for this trade agreement with the European Union, clearly there are many, many winners under this agreement. But you know, we live in a rapidly changing world where creative disruption is becoming the norm. And you know, Canadians must be ready and willing to adapt. So I know there are going to be many winners under this agreement. There will also be some that are adapters, that will have to adapt. And let me give you an example why I believe that Canadians are up to this challenge. Think about when the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement was being negotiated, back some 25 years ago. And the wine industry in Canada said, you can't open up the border to US wines. It's going to cause us to go bankrupt. We'll lose our industry. It'll be over. And you know, the government of the day, Brian Mulroney's Conservative government, at least they had the vision and the understanding of what Canadians were capable of. And the agreement came into force, and the industry looked at itself and said, you know what? We're going to reinvest in who we are as a wine industry. We're going to invest in technology, in knowledge, and we're simply going to get better at what we do here in Canada when it comes to the wine industry. Today, 25 years later, we have a world-ranking wine industry. Not because we're protecting them with artificial barriers, because they are simply good at what they do. They're among the very best in the world, winning awards all over the world. So to those Canadians that maybe find themselves adapting to this agreement, take courage. We are innovative as Canadians. We can address changes in the evolving global marketplace, and this agreement will certainly achieve that. So let me talk about the opportunity, Mr. Speaker. As with all other trade negotiations, CETA was a very difficult one. In fact, it was among our most difficult negotiations because of the high level of ambition both the European Union and Canada wanted to achieve. It was a highly complex negotiation, one that involved new and novel approaches. And so we now have this agreement almost in place, and it puts Canada in the enviable position, as I mentioned earlier, of having a free trade agreement with both the European Union and the United States. But think of the advantage that Canadian companies now have over the United States. The United States being our fiercest competitors. The United States does not have a free trade agreement with the European Union. They started negotiating one. That is badly stalled, and now with the election of President-elect Donald Trump, we expect that there will be very little, if any, further movement on negotiating this trade agreement between the United States and the EU, which they call CETA. It means that Canadian companies now have a once-in-a-lifetime advantage over their American competitors to access the European market. That's why we're encouraging them to get out there, be proactive, start exploring the European marketplace. And it's a huge opportunity for us to attract investment from parts of the world that traditionally have not looked at Canada, because we now have a truly competitive investment advantage over other countries around the world, having access to a consumer market, including the US and EU, of 800 million consumers. So are there still challenges, Mr. Speaker? Of course there are. CETA has not yet passed the European Parliament, and so we expect that will happen this December, and I'm hoping it will in fact pass. And it's also now generally acknowledged that the CETA that our Conservative government negotiated is actually a lesser agreement than what we had originally negotiated. For whatever reason, the Liberal government agreed to reopen discussions. I fear that investor-state dispute settlement is going to end up falling by the wayside because it's no longer part of provisional coming into force. The regional governments throughout Europe will now have a say, and whether they approve of that, my concern is that it will never see the light of day. So I believe this may be a lesser agreement that we had bargained for. I also note that the European Union agreed to provide its regional governments with agricultural safeguards to protect against import surges, something we didn't expect was going to happen. And it's not clear what that provision is going to have, what the impact will be on our agricultural producers like the beef and the pork exporters in Canada. There's also further work required to address some of the behind-the-borders issues, the sanitary and the phytosanitary standards that concern our producers. And of course, I also note that the compensation package that our government had announced for the dairy producers is now being abandoned by this Liberal government. It is a lesser package that they are offering to the dairy industry. We're very disappointed in that. And finally, of course, we also have to inspire our small and medium-sized businesses to take advantage of this agreement. Canadians are notoriously cautious when it comes to expanding their export and trade horizons. And I would just encourage Canadian companies, if they're going to go to one source, go to the point source for information on trade in Canada, and that is our Trade Commissioner Service. I got to know these folks well. They are some of the very best professionals, most knowledgeable trade experts in the world. And what they do, there's about 1,000 of them across Canada and around the world in 150 offices. One goal, to promote Canadian businesses and Canadian business interests all around the world. So go to the Trade Commissioner Service if you're looking for opportunities. So you know, Mr. Speaker, this free trade agreement is about a bold, new future for Canada. And let me be clear, trade is not for the weak-kneed or the faint of heart. It is not for the timid or for those who cower in the face of adversity. It is not for the skeptics and scoffers, and I note that there are some in the corner of this House today, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, there's a tinfoil hat brigade in the corner of this House that doesn't understand trade and the opportunities to use trade to grow our national prosperity. Trade is for champions. It's for people who measure and take calculated risks, who venture beyond the status quo and beyond the same old, same old. It's for visionaries who seize opportunity when it comes knocking and achieve extraordinary results for the people they serve, their companies, their employees, and their country. So, Mr. Speaker, let me say I'm honored to be surrounded today by many of my colleagues who actually do share that vision of trade, who are champions in their own right, and are prepared to do the heavy lifting to ensure that CETA lifts Canada to unprecedented prosperity. So let's get to work. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the Canadians we represent. Let's not squander that advantage. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his speech, as well as for his work on this file. It is truly a pleasure on our part to have taken up this torch and brought it home, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to ask him, tapping in on his wealth of experience. He mentioned the NAFTA agreement way back when it was negotiated. I can't admit to being that old to remember it, Mr. Speaker, as well as he does. But perhaps he could help us. Perhaps he could give us suggestions in terms of the implementation of CETA and how we could make it benefit our small and medium-sized enterprises.
Honourable Member for Abbotsford.
Well, I thank the member for the question, also for his hard work in finally moving this agreement close to the finish line. I mentioned the Trade Commissioner Service, but we also have industry organizations across the country representing the different industrial sectors who have been highly engaged in the negotiations of this free trade agreement. And many of our companies across Canada are members of those associations, whether it's the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the CFIB, whether it's the Canadian Exporters and Importers. These are all organizations that have really engaged in raising the awareness amongst our small and medium-sized businesses of the opportunities this trade agreement presents. But I would also note, Mr. Speaker, since the member mentioned NAFTA, back when the North American Free Trade Agreement was being negotiated, guess who was actually against it? The Liberal Party of Canada. They fought against that agreement every step along the way. They said we were going to lose our health care system, our pension system, we were going to hollow out our economy, our culture would be gone. And of course, none of that happened. There's one party in this House that understands trade and the opportunities that trade represents for Canadians, and that's this Conservative Party.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Cowichan, Malahat, Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as a proud member from the party in this corner of the House, I will unapologetically stand up for those Canadians who do have concerns with these trade deals. And I think, out of respect for all the views that all Canadians have, I think that while we may disagree, we should at least try and bring some respect to this place about those different viewpoints. However, in an effort to turn this conversation to a more collegial route, I just wanted to ask the member, because I know he has a lot of experience on this file. I wanted to bring his attention to the specifics of one country, and that's the United Kingdom. As he may very well be aware, 42% of Canada's exports to the EU go to that one country, to the UK, and a large part of the CETA negotiations were based on the premise that the UK would still be a part of CETA. And I don't think the Liberal government has properly evaluated CETA without the UK. So I'd like to ask the member, if the UK triggers its exit from the EU and leaves CETA, is he comfortable with the concessions that Canada has made in CETA, given that the UK represents nearly half of Canada's exports to the EU?
The Honourable Member for Abbotsford.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me first of all commend that member for his good understanding of what CETA entails and what the possible consequences of Brexit are on this agreement. I've actually been involved in some public fora where I've expressed my concern over what Brexit means for the Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement. If they exit, what happens to the market access that we had expected to get? It is our largest export market in the European Union. In fact, Canada's trade relationship with the United Kingdom is one of its most significant trade relationships. And so the Brexit puts us into uncharted waters. This agreement had essentially been negotiated before Brexit happened. Not a lot of people expected Brexit to happen, but it did happen. So the member is asking me a question, what are the impacts? Do I believe that this Liberal government has actually undertaken the due diligence to understand what this means? I don't know. I'm skeptical whether they've done that work. when we were dealing with the carbon pricing, the carbon tax announcement that the Prime Minister made. It's very clear they did no economic impact analysis on that. I expect that the announcement they made about abandoning coal-fired electricity had no economic impact analysis, and I expect that the Brexit impact on this trade negotiation with the EU has also not been well understood by the Liberal government. So I share his concerns, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah. Questions and comments. Question commentaire. The honourable member for Foothills.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank my honourable colleague for his great speech with some great information, and thank him as well on behalf of the residents of Southern Alberta for how hard he worked on affecting this deal. My riding of Foothills is, the heart of cattle country, the home of Alberta beef, some of the best malting barley in the world, metallurgic coal. Some of these things and my stakeholders in my riding are very excited about the opportunity that CETA and the new markets that this will bring. And I realize how hard they worked to bring this, but I also understand how close this came to collapsing because of the meddling, let's say, of the Liberal government. I'm having residents of my riding very concerned that almost losing CETA, despite us doing all the work getting it almost to the finish line, they're now very legitimate concerns of they will do much the same with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which ranchers, farmers, miners, energy workers are very excited to see that also come to fruition. I would like to ask my colleague, does he share those same concerns that meddling with a TPP agreement, which is also been agreed upon in principle, does he share those concerns of what may happen to TPP?
And the honourable member for Abbotsford.
Well, Mr. Speaker, unlike the Canada-Europe Free Trade Agreement, the Liberals actually haven't come out and said they support the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Boy, that would be sad if we weren't part of that agreement if and when it gets ratified. We're talking about 12 countries representing forward-looking trading partners, countries like Australia and New Zealand. Why wouldn't we want to have a trade agreement with those countries? Japan, third largest economy in the world. Why wouldn't we want to have a trade agreement with Japan to open up new markets for Canadian exporters, especially agricultural producers? And unfortunately, there's been deafening silence on the Liberal side. Now, when it comes to agriculture, of course, there are some challenges that our producers face, our agricultural producers face under CETA. We haven't yet fully negotiated some of the behind-the-border standards and rules and regulations, the sanitary and phytosanitary issues that bedevil our agricultural exporters. And unfortunately, as part of this negotiation, the Liberal government opened up the door to the EU actually applying safeguards for import surges, as I mentioned in my speech. We don't know what impact that will have on our producers like the beef and the pork exporters in Canada. So we're still looking to see what that looks like. And it's unfortunate that that agreement was opened up as much as it is. But it is important for us to focus today on the fact that legislation is before us, and if it is passed and this agreement is ratified, it will still be of remarkable benefit to Canadians and our long-term prosperity.
Yeah.
Questions and comments. Question commentaire. The honourable member for Newmarket Aurora.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for his contribution to the debate today. It's great to hear him speak about it. I'm have the pleasure of serving on the Trade Committee with some of his colleagues as well, and they can attest to the fact that I actually credited that member for his great work getting the agreement to where we are today. As well as his colleague from Battleford's Lloydminster. I also gave him some credit for his work to do. So I do thank the member for his mostly magnanimous speech today. And I just want to ask him, or give him the opportunity maybe, to comment on some of the opponents of CETA, and perhaps opponents in free trade in general, and how perhaps maybe some of their fears aren't founded, and how we can work together to make sure we can alleviate some of those fears and let them know that this agreement will work for all Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Abbotsford.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I did refer to some of the naysayers in this House as being skeptics and scoffers, and they are exactly that. I don't apologize for that comment at all. These are people that do not understand the role that trade plays in Canada's national prosperity. When I think of the fact that they have continued to opine that Canada is going to lose its cultural identity, that we're going to lose our healthcare system, that we're going to lose our pension system, that our economy will be hollowed out, millions of jobs would be lost. You know, over the last 25 years since we've had the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA, None of that has happened. History has shown that when trade is done right, it has the capacity to enhance the standard of living for millions and millions of people, not only in Canada, but around the world. So I'm encouraging the NDP in this House, for once, sit down and come up with a coherent trade policy. They supported trade agreements with Jordan and South Korea, and yet one of the most like-minded trading partners, the European Union, they're now saying no. You know, no one can make sense of their trade policy, so I'm asking them to go back to the drawing boards and see if they can get this right.